For weeks, 100,000 Iraqi troops have been reported massing near the border. Word that Iraq has invaded neighboring state of Kuwait.
We seek the immediate, unconditional, and complete withdrawal of all Iraqi forces from Kuwait.
White House officials say even now Saddam Hussein could avoid a war with a massive pullout of his forces.
Unless Saddam Hussein withdraws from Kuwait by late winter, the U.S. will go to war.
Here, and apparently there's a total of 425,000 U.S. troops here. That's an increase of 10,000 over the last time we were briefed.
This is, something is happening outside. Skies over Baghdad have been illuminated. We're seeing bright
planes and missiles.
The liberation of Kuwait has begun.
And I'm just going to be quiet and let you listen.
I've told the American people before that this will not be another Vietnam.
This will not be another Vietnam, so said President George Herbert Walker Bush in 1991 as we began our conflict in the Gulf, better known as the Gulf War. Welcome back, folks, to our first ever members exclusive broadcast. It's a pleasure to have you join me today on the 3rd of July, one day before America's Independence Day celebration, as I reflect on my memories and my experiences in the Gulf War. Now, bear in mind that in the Gulf War, I was not a new soldier. I had been experienced as a soldier for some time, but I was a new officer, just a second lieutenant, my first combat experience in the Persian Gulf. What I hope to do in this presentation or this conversation with you, and I'll have to glance over here for the chat because I don't have access to the chat because I'm not a paying member of my own channel. I will try to answer your questions as best I can. I'm going to run through some slides and photographs of my experiences and relate these things to you and get your thoughts about this. Anyway, so folks, without much ado, let's get started. Yes, this is the jersey or the camouflage top that I wore when I came out of the Gulf. Now, I never wore this in combat. We were forced to acquire this at Khobar Towers after the war in order to fly home. We were told no one could fly home for optics, for PR purposes. They didn't say that, but that was the purpose of it, without wearing this, what we call the chocolate chip desert camouflage uniform. And this thing still fits me here after 35 years. Look at that. Still fits. Anyway, so, yeah, this is, and you can see here on my sleeve the 3rd Armor Division that was sewn on then, along with the American Expeditionary Patch. And, of course, over here it was 3rd Armor Division, which was the unit that I was assigned to. This is a worn patch because I had it. This was a newer one, a little better. I put it on after I got back. Yeah, so I never actually wore this in combat. I wore this uniform exactly one day in 36 and a half years in the U.S. Army. 36 years. It's no longer a uniform in the U.S. Army, so I'm not violating a uniform code here. It no longer is a valid uniform. This is an historic uniform at this stage, the chocolate chip. There was also another pattern that came out. We called them the Pecan Sandies, which were quite popular with the Air Force. So I'm going to have to move this over here because otherwise I cannot see your chat, folks. So I apologize for that. Let me do this like this, and then we can see the chat. Okay, so is that a little bit better? Well, it's not better, but that'll help. Anyway, it helps me see the chat. So welcome. Let me say hello to all the members that are here. It's a members exclusive. Matt Canales looking forward to it. Antoinette LaRue Altour. Murder Death Kill says hello. Courtney says in 2018 was at Camp Arifan in Kuwait. Was part of the Defense Logistics Agency. Okay, thank you for that. Jan Filion, Nick Muller, John Jarvis. What is reutilization? Oh, yeah, that's reuse. And Nick Muller says, my stopwatch is running for the first. Thank you for your service. No disrespect intended. You're welcome. Elma 5 Pence, Erica, Deborah Morey, Matt Canale, and we're up to 21 viewers here at the moment. Elma 5 Pence, I said already. Teresa, Shack Dwellers here. Hey, good to see you again. Sloat Steenkamp, and Courtney McBride. Note the Greek letter on the armored vehicles behind Chris in the picture. What does it mean? It's not a Greek letter. It's a V, an inverted V. We weren't using Greek letters. That was for identification of friend or foe. And I'll get to that here in a little bit later on. Janet Liddy says, hello, welcome to you. You're at your local library. Okay. Uniform, 35 years, can't believe it's been that long ago. It has been, you know, well, 30, it was 90, so 33 years ago, 30, when it first went. David says, thank you for your service. Hank Cloper's here. I haven't seen Hank in a while. Dollingers and Mr. Punisher as the audience grows slightly. Thank you all for joining me. Let's get back to it now, folks. All right, so let me just run through this. Let me see if this will work out very well. I'm going to try this. I think this is the image I want. There you go. Okay, so I just need to move myself a little bit this way. So memories of the storm, my Gulf War experiences. Now what I'll do is I'll rotate between you seeing me on camera and also you seeing that. So just stick with me, folks. This should be interesting. All right, so let's get started. Memories of the Gulf War. So I've got a lot of software open here and I've got to make this happen just right. Otherwise, it's not going to be very effective. All right, so did that work? No, it did not work. Why did that not change? Okay, that did not change. Or did it change? It did change. Is it changed on the screen? It is. Okay, good. So this was the map, the famous map that was drawn to show the Hail Mary operation that Army Central, ARCENT, under General Norman Schwarzkopf, attempted to overrun the Iraqis and recapture Kuwait, liberate it, and push the Iraqis back. You can see that what it was, the Hail Mary was an effort by our forces to do an end run, and this was actually a plan that was on the shelf all along. Central Command had formulated the plan some years prior, that if we ever invaded Iraq, if they invaded Kuwait, how would we do it? Well, they came up with the football analogy of the end run. So instead of running right up the middle, back into Kuwait, where the defenses and the teeth of the defenses were, you would run around the flank and outflank them on the outside. That's called the end run. And I was part of that end run, going around Kuwait and then into Kuwait from the northeast, which was pretty interesting. So that looks like that worked. So let's get that back up here. All right, and we'll see if it continues. So that's the famous map. You can see on there lots of units, and those units include, of course, none other than my own division, the 3rd Armored Division, which is located at the bottom of that map. 7th Corps, 1st Armored Division, 1st UK Division, 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, and 1st Cav Division. All of those divisions were part of the 7th Corps. And you can see as they move forward, the symbols continue to go up. You see the Armored Divisions in those triangle with the blue, yellow, and red. Those are 1st and 3rd Armored Divisions as we move forward and into Kuwait. So that's a rather famous image there that people are very familiar with. All right, so this was the structure and where we came from. I was based in Germany at the time as a 2nd Lieutenant in the 3rd Battalion, 8th Cavalry. And I'll tell you briefly about the 3rd Battalion, 8th Cavalry. It was not a cavalry unit. It was actually an armor unit. And what happened, ladies and gentlemen, is that in 1987, 133 Armor, which had been in Gelnhausen since the 1950s after the Second World War, 133 Armor men of war were redesignated 3rd Battalion, 8th Cavalry, and 4th Battalion, 8th Cavalry. We weren't cavalry, we were armor, and I'm not sure why they did that, but that was a designation. And that is a designation my unit carried from 1987 until 1991 after the Gulf War, when it was disbanded in November of 1991. So we were Honor and Courage, which was the 8th Cavalry, and we were actually armor units, which confuses people. But the interesting thing is that those 2 battalions, the 3rd Battalion, 8th Cavalry, and the 4th Battalion, 8th Cavalry, both located at Coleman Barracks, what was the name? I can't remember the name of the barracks down in Gelnhausen where we're at. I think it was Coleman Barracks, but we were in Gelnhausen, and those 2 battalions were the only battalions in the entire U.S. Army inventory equipped with the latest M1 tanks, the M1A1 heavies, as they were described at that time, with extra suspension, and they weigh a bit more than the other tanks and had a bit better mobility. So we had the M1 Abrams, M1A1 heavy in those 2 battalions. So that's the 3rd Battalion, 8th Cavalry. We were based in Gelnhausen, just to the east of Frankfurt. And our headquarters was in Frankfurt. As you can see from this, are we up? Okay, that's what should be on air. Okay, I think I'm transmitting the correct thing on air. So you should have in front of you now the template. So let me just, I'm sorry, this is very awkward for me. Okay, it is the correct one. Good. All right, so how was U.S. Army able to move so fast? How do you keep up with the tanks? Because we went very slowly, Theodorus. I'm going to talk about that. That's one of the challenges. So this was, on the left-hand side, you see a map of where we were in the western part of Germany, the Federal Republic of Germany. Those are combat units that were available for deployment, including the 3rd Armored Division. You see that circle over the 3rd Armored Division. The flag actually shows up in eastern Germany, but it was based in Frankfurt if you follow the arrow down. If you look on the right-hand side, that's Army Central. That was General Schwarzkopf's command, one of the what now are called combined combatant commanders. That command in January 1991 had the 18th Airborne Corps and the 7th Corps, and we were the 7th Corps. You see the 1st UK Armored Division, 1st Infantry Division, and then down there in the circle is the 3rd Armored Division, which was my unit. And that's how we got started there. So, little complicated going back and forth here, folks. So apologies. I think I need to make it a little bit brighter in here. How's that? A little bit better. That's a little better lighting there. So a little bit complicated, but I'll keep working through this. So the next slide I want to show you here. This was when I arrived at the port, and I'm going to use dual screen for this one. See how that goes. There you go. So this is at the port. In December of 1990, I was notified after coming back from gunnery and training exercise at Grafenwehr Training Center and Hohenfels Combined Maneuver Training Center, CMTC. After that rotation, I was gone for 6 weeks for those events, then came back and found out almost immediately that we were going to be added to the 7th Corps. Normally, the 3rd Armored Division had been assigned to the 5th Corps, based in Frankfurt, we were reassigned to the 7th Corps, which was based in Stuttgart, because the 7th Corps is the corps that was deployed to the Gulf War, and they took divisions from all over Germany, not simply those assigned to the 7th Corps. When I arrived as part of the advance party just before Christmas, I spent my Christmas in 1990 in Cement City, which is difficult to see on the map, but it's on that map. I arrived and then was sent to Cement City, which was a cement plant and full of rats and refuse. It was not very pleasant. I was one of the early arrivals there. And you can see the photograph in the top of that is one that I took. That's my photograph. The one there, that's Khobar Towers on the way into approaching it. The government of Saudi Arabia, in an effort to take care of the Bedouins there, they built this apartment complex to allow the Bedouins to live there rent-free. The Bedouins moved in and they promptly said, where do we put our goats and sheep? There was no accommodation for the goats and sheep. They were nomadic people, and so they refused to live in it. So this complex was almost entirely empty and devoid of people when we went to Dammam in 1990. And so my battalion was the first unit to occupy these facilities, known as Khobar Towers. And that's a photograph I took approaching it, going into the entrance point of Khobar Towers straight down that road. The bottom left-hand photo is a photograph of Khobar Towers, the famous spot where the explosion happened. I have a photograph of myself, which I was unable to locate, standing in front of that in my kit. And on the right is a photograph of the port of Dammam, where we were taking stuff into the country. Our equipment came in there by boat coming down from Europe, and that's how we move things around. So from there, I moved out to the tactical assembly area, which was located in the northeastern portion of the country, but northwest from Dammam. And this was known as the Tactical Assembly Area Henry. It was east of King Khalid Military City, or KKMC, which is a massive military base built for the Saudis by the Americans to house their forces. And this is January 1991. It all looks peaceful. If you can look in the silhouette, the sky there, you'll see in the distance a little hump of a tent, a GP medium on the right-hand side. And then on the left are toilets and showers, very difficult to see. This was what greeted me. It was like the surface of Mars when I first got out to what became Tactical Assembly Area Henry after spending a couple weeks at Cement City and then moving out on the Tap Line Road, which was known as Main Supply Route Audi. The main supply routes were named after automobiles. The one from Dammam to Riyadh was known as MSR Toyota, and MSR Audi was the route that ran from Dammam up the coast towards Kuwait and then over towards Hafr al-Batin, and then you go down to KKMC, King Khalid Military City. So that's the environment that met me. When I first arrived there, it was like looking at the surface of Mars. The surface of this part of Saudi Arabia looked like a human being had never crossed it. There were no foot trails, there were no paths, no rubbish, nothing. We occupied completely unoccupied space. Now, of course, there were Bedouins somewhere near there, and they're floating around, but it appeared to be completely unoccupied. That's how it looked when you arrived. It was fascinating, to say the least. So the next thing that happened, of course, ladies and gentlemen, was we had to build our camp. And the reason I went on the advance party was I got sent there to build the camp. And this is a photograph I took in early January of 2021 after our camp began to take shape. So this is Tactical Assembly Area Henry, east of King Khalid City in January of 2021. You'll see the left-hand side there, that GP Small, that small tent, hex tent we call them. That hex tent was my luxury accommodation. I lived in that for about a month. And then in the distance there, you see showers in the far distance. There's actually someone down there near the shower and a water buffalo next to it. And then we have our toilets. The box toilets were for number 2. And you can't see it very well in the photograph, but those are what we call piss tubes. Now, the piss tubes were water bottles, disused water bottles that were taken, and those water bottles were put in the ground. We drove them into the ground, and then we urinated into water bottles after we dug a hole in the ground so the urine would seep into the soil. Those are called piss tubes. Now, you're probably starting to say, hey, what about the ladies? Folks, there were no ladies. This is an armor battalion, all male. Combat arms, no females, no woke, no nonsense, no gender integration. That was in combat service support units. We were a combat arms unit and all males. So there was no latrine for the females. And besides, they could use the number 2 to sit down if they had to go to the bathroom. But the piss tubes were just so that people wouldn't clog up the toilets. And that's where I lived for a month. When I first arrived there at this location, what happened with meals is that we had shipped meals ahead. We didn't have cooks. We didn't have mess kits. We didn't have kitchens. We didn't have any of that stuff. There's nowhere place to order pizza in. So what we had were burner stoves, and we'd get gas, and we had the ability to use tea rations. Tea rations are pre-prepared meals for massive groups of people. They would come in tins, and I ate for about 3 weeks every day for 2 meals, lasagna with blueberry cake. That's what my meal was every day for about 2 weeks, as we waited for the main body to close to bring the kitchens and all the material necessary to cook rations out there. After that, we would get 2 hot meals per day delivered by mermites. Mermites are containers that you put metal containers inside. 3 go inside. It's insulated. They're durable, made of aluminum. And then you put boiling water down in there, which keeps the food warm inside the thermos. And you lift the top and you ladle out the food. We usually get our food from that. So twice a day from the kitchen, those things would come. They're called mermites. And then we'd have 1 meal ready to eat, and that would be our meals. That was after the main body closed. When I first arrived, there was an advance party. We didn't have that luxury. We just had the tea rations. And my recollections, I'll tell you folks, the tea rations were pretty good. I enjoyed that lasagna and that blueberry cake every day. It was pretty tasty. And I miss it. It's the only time in my entire 36-year career in the U.S. Army I ever had tea rations. Now, I've had C rations. When I was enlisted, I was at Fort Gordon at Advanced Individual Training. The Army still had C rations, and they were pretty nasty, except for the John Wayne bars. They were a cookie bar that we liked. We called them John Wayne bars. I'm not sure why. So I've had C rations. I've had tea rations. I've had meals ready to eat. So anyway, I had them all. But there you go. Desert just absorbed all the stuff, even the white gold. Correct, Debbie. That is correct. But we were probably not hydrating properly, so it was probably gold, not white gold most of the time. So that was the situation. So that's what the tactical assembly area looked like, folks. And that's where we were. So let's get back to that. And this is what life looked like. You see, it's like the surface of Mars. There's nothing. There's no elevation. There's no hills. There's no undulating terrain. It is flat and nothing is there. And that's what we were greeted by. Well, this is some of my colleagues. And there's Scott Lakoskis, who was our signals intelligence officer. A different time, a different age. Look at that calendar that was sent to him. It came in the mail with half-naked ladies. We don't do those things anymore, apparently. That was myself, the chemical officer to his left, one of the operations officer to the right, and then Sergeant De La Maza, who was worked for Lieutenant Lakoskis. This is us here in the tactical assembly area before we went to combat. Obviously, you can see me there, if anybody recognizes me in that photograph. Does that look familiar, vaguely familiar there, that gentleman there? So what do you guys think of that? Let's take a look at that. There you go. So you can see a picture of me in 1990. Oh, January 91 by the time these folks arrived, and today in 2023. Slight difference there, just a little bit of difference there. Anyway, so there you go. So people, feel free to comment if you've got questions. I'll try to answer them. I'm switching back and forth to make sure I don't miss anything. So that was in the assembly area there. Now, from Shield to Storm, let's transition how we went from Desert Shield to Desert Storm, which occurred in January when our aircraft started bombing Iraq. But before that, this is what things look like, and I'll show you how we got out to where we're going very quickly here, so you get an appreciation for that as well. So we were assigned to 7th Corps, as I mentioned. 7th Corps was broken down in the following format: 1st Armored Division, 1st Infantry Division Mechanized, 1st Cav Division, which was from Fort Hood. 1st Infantry Division, 1st Armored Division was from Ansbach, Germany. 1st Infantry Division was based in Fort Riley. 1st Cav Division was based at Fort Hood. The 11th Aviation Brigade was based in Germany. The 7th Corps Artillery is based in Germany. 3rd Armored Division, ourselves, we were the unit from Germany. We were the only division from Germany that 7th Corps had, as they left the rest of the troops there. And the 2nd ACR, which was based in Germany as well, 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, along with the United Kingdom's 1st Armored Division. And then all the stuff that comes along with it. So the Corps had 1,487 tanks, 1,384 infantry cavalry fighting vehicles, 568 artillery pieces, 132 multiple rocket launchers, 8 missile launchers, 242 attack helicopters, 142,661 soldiers assigned to the 7th Corps in January of 1991 as we were in the assembly areas. The road on the right is called Tapline Road. It runs from the east coast of Saudi Arabia out to the Hafr al-Batin, and that is the road in which we transported all of our tanks to get to combat. That was something else. I traveled that road many times, very dangerous. A lot of fatalities because they hired third country nationals from Pakistan and from Sri Lanka and all these other countries, and Filipinos who just drove like nut jobs. They had no license. They weren't experienced drivers, and they drove these big, heavy equipment transporters, HETs, heavy equipment transporters. Imagine a truck big enough to have a trailer behind it to put a 60-ton tank on it, or 2 60-ton tanks on it. That's what these things were. It was pretty incredible. A lot of fatalities. I saw some really bad accidents. In fact, one time when I was traveling out there on Tap Line Road, what happened to me is that we went about a kilometer into the desert around this massive pileup of about 30 or 40 vehicles that had an accident in poor conditions and fog in the morning when these idiots just drove right into each other and to get back on the tap line. It was pretty crazy stuff, folks. It's wild. Something else. What an experience that was. Absolutely. Well, next I want to show you, this was our battalion staff that we went to war with right here. You can see that 3rd Battalion, 8th Cavalry, 3rd Armored Division. The image on the right is the unit crest, honor and courage for 8th Cavalry. And that is, you can see 3 people wearing the desert camouflage. And those 3 people are our Air Force personnel. None of us are wearing that stuff. Only the Air Force personnel are wearing those. You can see that we wore the battle dress uniform, the desert camouflage. I'm in the back on the right-hand side there holding a T-shirt up. And we were the only ones, the Air Force were the only ones wearing the camouflage fatigues that I'm wearing now. They got them issued by the Air Force. And here's another nice little tidbit. Not only did they get those uniforms, but the Air Force guys also came to war in a temporary duty status, or as Courtney would know, TDY. They didn't deploy in combat. They were sent TDY. They got paid hotel rates and per diem meals each day they were in combat, plus credit for combat and combat pay and tax exclusion. What a good deal. We didn't get that. We were deployed there. All we got was combat exclusion later on. But the Air Force guys all had their nice uniforms like this that were issued by the Air Force in Germany. We fought the entire time we were there. The entire 6 months I spent in Saudi Arabia, I wore the battle dress uniform, the woodland camouflage pattern that you see me wearing there. This was only on the final day when I flew out. You got to love it. You got to love the Army, man. You got to love it. So that's just how things were, folks. That's exactly how things were. Crazy world. Yep. Air Force Base has a really plush golf course. They do. Yep, they do. How'd they get all the armor there? Well, they shipped them all. They weren't flown. They were all shipped by ship from the States and from Europe. That's why the buildup took 6 months. And that's why it took a long time to get all this stuff there, because it took 6 months to get everything into country. And Dammam, the port was, you could have planned a better war from a standpoint logistically than what happened here. Number one, the Saudis let us come in without question. They welcomed us in. They wanted us there to defend them. They were terrified that Saddam Hussein was going to invade. So they let us in. We had not total control, but we nearly had all of the freight movement at the port, bringing in all our ships day after day, 24 hours a day for 5 or 6 months. Well, actually for about 4 months, because ships had to get en route. We also had tons of ammunition and storage in Livorno, Italy, which was war stock available to fight the Cold War. That ammunition was shipped down through the Suez Canal, down to Saudi Arabia, and was brought in. Saddam Hussein sat back and watched us build up this force for 6 months, and only once did he make an effort at the Battle of Khafji to do something to dissuade us from coming. So he really let us build up. We were given 6 months to put the forces on the ground by the Iraqis. We were given all the space on the planet to build forces, to set camps, and to train by the Saudis. We had the port facilities. And then the most important part of all this is we had our own petrol station. The Saudi refineries along the coast at Dammam are producing all this diesel and gasoline and JP8, aviation fuel, and we had access to it. We didn't pay for any of it. It was all shipped to us at no cost. The Saudis ate the cost of all of that. And on top of that, countries around the world gave us billions of dollars in recompense. So basically the Gulf War was paid for not by American taxpayers. We were reimbursed by the Japanese, the Germans, the Saudis, the Kuwaitis, and others who gave us billions, tens of billions of dollars, which recovered the cost of this. This was an unbelievable conflict, one that will never have these perfect circumstances ever again introduced. I guarantee it, folks. It will never, ever happen again. It is unbelievable to have such a situation like this. We'll never get this kind of thing. We didn't get our own gas station in Afghanistan or in Iraq. We didn't get unfettered access to ports to get us into those places. It was truly a unique situation, which we'll never see replicated in the history of humankind again. So what kind of systems do we have? We had lots of systems, but these two stand out the most. These are the M1 Abrams tank on the left-hand side and then the M2 Bradley fighting vehicle on the other side. Now, the chevron that you're talking about, those go on there, but there's a chevron that's on the tank you can see that's painted in an inverted V pointing to the sky. Those were identification friend or foe, so we wouldn't have fratricide. The idea was that we wouldn't shoot each other. That's why those things were there. Now, they had limited reliability because they weren't visible in the dark, and we had Apaches kill Americans thinking they were Iraqis trying to break through the wire, killed a ground surveillance radar team, just blew them up with a hellfire, and they killed them. It was a fratricide incident. We had a number of fratricides. Fortunately, in my unit, there was no fratricide. None of us killed each other, thank goodness. It was very complicated and chaotic in combat at times, as you can imagine. So let's get started with the war. So here's the tactical assembly area, okay? That's what that is. The red arrow there points to where TAA Henry's at. The gold stars, if you start over there on the side, it's difficult to see because the Persian Gulf doesn't show up in blue very well. It's kind of white, but I'll make it easier for you by putting it here and then describing. All right, so Dammam, which is where the port facility was at, just to the west of Bahrain, had a gold star. And then they take the main supply route, and I put the gold star on that route Audi, which ran up about 200 miles to Hafr al-Batin. From there, you head south down towards the red arrow, just to the east of King Khalid Military City. We were the division closest. Is that 1st Canadian or 1st Cav division? 1st Cav was on the west. We were on the east of King Khalid Military City, which actually was a location we used more than once. It was very helpful. So big movement, lots of people, one route to get these thousands of tanks out to where they were going. It's pretty crazy when you think about that. Just one route to get all these tanks out to where they're going. And it's amazing that we actually pulled this off. Absolutely amazing we pulled this off. It's, again, you know, the Iraqis never interdicted us when we were moving along that route. So, you know, that's kind of how things went there. So this is really complicated, guys. I'm moving like 5 different windows here to make sure this is smooth for you. All right, so you can see the shift here as we go into the assembly areas. So coming up from the assembly areas, moving up to the forward assembly areas. Now, as we transition to combat, this is what happened. You can see on this map at the bottom, King Khalid Military City's got a little blue circle there. Above that is the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment. And then ours is down in the center. That's 3rd Armored Division, Tactical Assembly Area Henry. And you can see the arrow as we move forward up into what was known as Forward Assembly Area Butts, just short of the neutral zone, which was the disputed territory between the Iraqis and the Saudis, which was never settled by treaty. So the Cav regiments moved up into the Army Cavalry regiments, moved up to screen in front of us, and we put our forward assembly areas located up there. So the forward assembly areas is where you move forward and you're prepped to start your combat. That's what's going on there. That's what a forward assembly area is. So you have a tactical assembly area where you have relative security away from the front, basically in the rear, and then you move to a forward assembly area, which is where you're able to conduct the combat from. And that's where we went. So forward assembly area Henry. So now this is the general situation that was taking place. Now these maps come out of the biography or the book on the 7th Corps' actions during this conflict. So this is the situation on 23rd of February 2020. Remember the war started, what, on the 16th or something like that, the 16th of January, I think it was, when the bombing campaign started. But on the 27th of February, after we pummeled them with air for about 6 weeks, we began a ground offensive because they would not retreat from they still stayed in Kuwait. You can see the Iraqi force dispositions in the Rumalia oil fields throughout Kuwait and arrayed to the west. But we went even further west with the 18th Airborne Corps out there, and they were headed up to Salman Air Base located in the north. But the U.S. 3rd Armored Division is located there in the center, and you can see us there. So Army Central is there, and then Joint Force Coalition North, and then you got the Marines. The Marines are in the east, and you got Joint Force Coalition East. We've got basically 4 armies there. We've got the Coalition forces in the east, at Kafchi, crossing the border. Then the Marines have a corps, so not really an army, a corps level. They're part of that army. And then you have Joint Forces North. So the Joint Forces North runs across there. Then you've got the 7th Corps and the 18th Airborne Corps, which are the Army Central. And so there you go. I said Schwarzkopf was our CENT commander. Actually, it was General Yeosak. Schwarzkopf was the combatant commander. So that is the situation as we are approaching and ready to go to combat on the 23rd of February, 1991. Remember, at this point, we're in the forward assembly areas, about to cross the border into the neutral zone. And this is not the Romulans. The neutral zone, crossing the neutral zone is ironic. The Romulans, Star Trek, and a huge Star Trek fan. But we were crossing the neutral zone into what became Iraq, and we took on the Iraqi forces there. So pretty crazy stuff at this stage. This is what it looked like in the forward assembly areas, folks. It was heaven. Not. You can see here that we were digging holes and living in holes, and you can see they're wet because it rained every day during the Gulf War. The photograph on the right is myself holding my steel pot and Master Sergeant Bowen, who was our senior NCO, wearing his tanker Nomax. That's the flame retardant stuff that's supposed to give you a couple seconds to get out of these vehicles if they catch on fire. You can see a deuce and a half in the background with the chevron painted on it. And then there's an M1 Abrams there that's backed up. You see the 50 number on the back of it. And there's one of the folks is drying his sleeping bag, which got soaked during the night. Now, let me explain something to you. That M1 Abrams has a turbine engine, and it puts out, I don't know, hundreds of degrees. Someone told me it was, I don't know. It's a very, very hot. You can't stand behind it. You'll get burned. You'll get singed. You'll get fried. So you have to back away from a little bit, and you have to be very careful not to spend a lot of time there. The Germans learned the hard lesson when we switched from the M60A3 to the M1 Abrams in Germany. We would go on road marches going to exercises. The tanks would be on the highways, and the Germans used to like to get right up on the tanks, get as close as they can, and then pass them. Well, Germans who did that when we first switched from the M60, which had a standard engine, not a turbine engine, to the M1 Abrams, which is like a jet engine. When we switched to that, they would pull up behind the M1 Abrams and all the paint would melt off the front of their car because it was so hot. They quickly learned that you can't do that. Anyway, but the upside of that is if you're wet in a place like this and you need to get dry, a sleeping bag, which is full of down feathers and very thick and stays wet for a long time, it would take all day to dry off or longer. It would stay wet and get moldy in that environment. Stand behind this turbine engine, and in less than a minute, your entire sleeping bag is completely dry. It was unbelievable, folks. It was, that's a nice thing to have. Nice advantage there. All right, so that is, that's what forward assembly area butts look like as we went across. Now, this is how we were arrayed. You can see the same photograph there. And this is where 7th Corps was located. You can see there in the 7th Corps area of operations, as we get ready to go into the neutral zone, the 1st Armored Division is on the left. The 3rd Armored Division is on the right. This is the left-hand side of the screen. And then in front of that, you have the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment. All these are units from Germany. 1AD, 3AD, and 2nd ACR. I think I said earlier 380 was the only, but I meant to say 180 was also from there. And you can see the order of march they're in. So we're marching into combat in a file at 10 miles per hour, 16 kilometers per hour, all vehicles moving at the same pace across the entire front. Hundreds of thousands of vehicles moving at 10 miles per hour. 2nd Brigade, 3rd Armored Division, my brigade was in the lead. You can see that right there. We were the lead unit right there on the, well, if you look to the left center of that map, you'll see that we were, where that circle's at, that's that circle. That's 2nd Brigade, 3rd Armored Division. 2nd Brigade, 3rd Armored Division was commanded by Colonel Higgins, a Vietnam veteran, and we called him Diggin' Higgins. And you can see on that photograph why we called him Diggin' Higgins. Everywhere we went, we were dug in. As I understood it, Colonel Higgins was a bit of an ass, an arrogant shithead. But as I recall, the story with Colonel Higgins was that in Vietnam, he had been in a unit as a young officer, a lieutenant like me now, 30 years later, and artillery came in and guys died needlessly because they didn't dig in. So that's why he was always about digging in. The irony is we were an armored unit and we had armored vehicles, but we would leave those armored vehicles at night, dig holes, and sleep in the holes. Actually, it makes sense if you think about it, because if enemy were to approach us at night and looking for targets, they would find those warm vehicles still. They would shoot at those and probably blow them up. If we're in the ground, we're not going to die. So you can't be on guard 24/7. You have to get some rest. When I say at night, we only slept for a couple hours. It wasn't like I dig that hole to sleep in it for like an hour and a half, 2 hours. Yeah. But Diggin' Higgins, we called him, and we dug in everywhere we went. So 2nd Brigade, 3rd Armored Division. So this is the array as we went right across the border. And this is how we started. And we started the turn almost immediately. We crossed the border. Phase line Vermont was the berm at the border, and that's the blue line at the bottom there. We went forward. And you can see that 3rd Armored Division was on that left flank, was the inside of it, and 2nd Brigade was in the lead behind the Cavalry Regiment as we went forward. And all the red boxes are Iraqi units, of course. So that's kind of how things looked as we crossed the border there, folks. And I hope that you're finding this interesting. Is this compelling or enjoyable for folks? Let me check on the hole's protected. Yes, they did, Erica. The hole's protected. Not a tank, but a jet. Yeah, exactly, Ants. American wars always remind me of Major General Smedley Butler. Did any South African Air Force? No, there were no South Africans who participated in this conflict. South Africa at the time was in the outhouse because of apartheid still. It rained every day, Erica. It rained every day of the conflict, the ground conflict. And it rained a lot from January and February. Yep. Courtney, you're getting ahead of the story here. I do know the Highway of Death. I have my own photographs. In this presentation, each and every time that I provide you with one of my own personal photographs, I'll mention it, okay? The maps are not mine. They all come from the official history. So let's go ahead and move on from there. So this is what it looked like crossing the berm, ladies and gentlemen, as we went across. Now, in there, none of those are my photographs. Those are all from the book. But that's crossing the berm into Iraq. Now, you can't see the berm there, but it's out in front of these vehicles. You can see that top right-hand photograph. Look at that visibility, how foggy it is. Now, we had a huge advantage as the U.S. military because our vehicles, our Apache helicopters and our Abrams tanks were equipped with devices that let us see through that, night vision goggles and thermal sights, which allow us to see through that fog. So the fog didn't matter to our main weapon systems, but it did matter to infantrymen. It did matter to people operating vehicles because you couldn't see very well, and we had to deal with that. So that was a huge challenge for us. Now, this is my photograph. I took this photograph with my crappy little Kodak disposable camera. Well, it wasn't disposable. What I wound up disposing of was some cheap plastic one, cost like, I think, $15 or $20. And I didn't get many photographs. But this is my battalion and a neighboring battalion, 418, off in the distance, as we march into combat crossing the berm. This is in just before we got into it, or actually might be right inside Iraq. So that was pretty interesting. Yeah, so that's... I took this picture from the top of my vehicle. You'll see a photo later in this presentation of the vehicle that I was in that actually where you can see where I can take these photographs from the top of it. So there you go. 3rd Battalion, 8th Cavalry marching into combat. This is on the 24th of February, 1991 is the date we're looking at here. So these were some of the obstacles that our forces confronted. Now, when we went through, we didn't see too many of these. We were fortunate because what happened was these were obstacles that were further to the east that were mostly put in place to stop the forces coming into Kuwait. We saw some obstacles out where we're at. Mostly it was the berm that they put up. They used Iraqi engineering forces to go out and build this huge pile of dirt several feet high, a couple meters high, so that vehicles couldn't drive over it. But of course, we just used engineer equipment to plow it away, and we drove through it. And unless it's covered by artillery and direct fire or direct fire weapon systems, putting a berm up has no effect as the engineers go out and simply clear the obstacle. And that's the engineers went out first and cleared the obstacles. Now, on this situation here, the engineers had a different challenge. This is what the 24th Infantry Division with the Marines and others had to face was these obstacles dug in the ground, plus these wires put out there to stop them from advancing on foot and messing up vehicles and wheeled vehicles. We didn't really face these obstacles. Mostly it was just a berm out west. So that was nice for us, I should say. Better for us than it could have been. So, yeah, not so bad. All right, here is the disposition of the Corps on the 25th of February after the conflict began. You can see that we've advanced deep into Iraq as we approach Kuwait. In the circle there at the top, you can see the 2nd Brigade, 3rd Armored Division as we advance. At this stage, we are now on the flank. The 1st Brigade is in the front and 3rd Brigade is in the rear. So it's two brigades in rear and 1 brigade forward. And Objective Collins, which is that big circle in the center top of the map, is where we're headed. But as this unfolded, ladies and gentlemen, as these events here unfolded, the Iraqis adjusted to it. They reacted to it. And, well, you would expect that. They're there for a reason. So the Iraqis started moving their forces forward in a counterattack, and you can see that from that red squiggly line coming forward. All those lines, they moved. Now, one of the units moved north to reinforce, but the red squiggly line came directly towards us at our Objective Collins, as if they knew where our objective was, but it's just a bunch of sand, so they wouldn't have known it. It wasn't like it was a terrain feature. So as they advanced, the Corps got a fragmentary or a frag order, a frago as we call it, and the frago was to change the objective and our phase lines. So this is as we moved out, and you can see this each and every morning. Every time we stopped, we dug in. Every time we stopped, we dug in our brigade. I don't know about the rest of the Army or the other 400,000 people there, but we dug in every time. Now, that vehicle on the right-hand side is the vehicle that I travel in and have fought in combat with. That's an M577 command track, and you can see it's got multiple antennas on top, and on the front, it has mounted a 50 caliber And that 50 cal crew serve weapon does not come with that vehicle. My NCO, who's inside the vehicle, went and got that for us. And you can see at the back, the hatch is open because I came out. This is a pause while we waited for tankers to refuel us. We were in combat at this time, and we were running out of fuel. And a Pennsylvania National Guard unit showed up with 5,000-gallon tankers, which refueled our tanks. So this was one pause in the battle that took place there in Iraq. This is already into Iraq. So yeah, that's, you can see, as I said, that's the M577. I lived and fought in that. Now, bear in mind, I'm going to get to some points here very soon about, this wasn't just, you see guys walking around in their fatigues. It wasn't that simple. When do you hear some of the challenges we faced? Going to get to that in just a moment. But let's go ahead and get back to the maps here, and I'll show you what's going on. So this is the frag order. I mentioned we had objective Collins. Suddenly we had new objectives, and our new objective was Minden. And we were to bypass the Talwalkana division and continue on to, or go through the Talwalkana division, and continue past objective Dorset to objective Minden, which is on the far right there. So that's 3rd Armored Division up there in the top. And we were supposed to go right through the Talwalkana division and then also attack the 10th Armored Division. So 2 divisions for our division to face. That was the plan going forward from that point. And it was a challenge, folks. It was a challenge. But you can see from the map that we got orders changed. This was on the 26th, I believe it was. We changed. It was the 27th. I'm trying to remember correctly which one it was. But yeah, so we got, our orders were altered based on events. Events unfold in combat and you change. So here are the phase lines for Tangerine on the 26th. The evening of the 26th, so we're already a couple days in this conflict and halfway through it, the ground conflict, and phase line Tangerine was just a straight line driven from the top of the map to the bottom, where all units were supposed to converge on that. At the bottom, you can see units from the 1st AD are going through Iraqi divisions and brigades, and then you can see us in the top there. We've gotten through objective Collins now, and we are, that's my brigade in the circle, 2nd Brigade, 3rd Armored Division, as we approach the 29th Brigade from the Talwalkana and the 46th Brigade from the Talwalkana. Yeah, that's as we move forward. This was, and there's one of the other 2 brigades from Talwalkana were down a little further south, and the 2nd ACR Armored Cavalry Regiment took them on. So in an attack, normally the way this works is you have 3 times the number of attackers, traditionally, historically, for military tactics, 3 times the number of attackers as defenders. So the fact that there's almost a 1-to-1 ratio here, there's 2 brigades of Iraqis and there's 2 brigades of us facing them, would seem to be the wrong odds. You want to have 3-to-1, so we should have 6 brigades to go against us too. But when you take into account our long-range fires from multiple launch rocket systems, our Apache helicopters with their Hellfire missiles, our air interdiction, which have been pummeling and destroying the Iraqis, plus the fact that our tanks can engage at a far longer range. For instance, we were in combat on the 2nd day of the war, and Captain Rafael Becerra, who is commander of Charlie Company, requested permission to engage. We've been told to hold our fire. We were at check fire. We weren't allowed to fire because there were some units moving, but Iraqi tanks began moving towards us, and Captain Becerra asked for permission to engage. Our battalion commander granted permission to engage. I listened to all this over the operations network as it unfolded, and I saw it happen as I climbed out of my track with a long cord that goes about 15 meters, about 10 meters, about 30 feet. I can walk 30 feet around the vehicle with that headset on and still hear what's going on the radio, and then switch a little thing on my side here to switch between networks. And I listened as they did the call. And so he was allowed to fire. Captain Becerra fired his Sabo round, his 120 millimeter Sabo round from his M1 Abrams, his command track, at a T-72 at 3.2 kilometers. Now, we were told that the M1 Abrams, his maximum effective range is 2 kilometers. Before we went to the Gulf War. That was the industry standard, 2 kilometers effective range, which is impressive. Can you imagine you shoot at something 2 kilometers away and you hit it dead on? That's amazing. And especially since the M1 Abrams can fire at 55 miles per hour, it can drive because of stabilizers, which keep the gun steady while the tank bounces, the gun doesn't move, and it can fire and hit a target at 2 kilometers. Well, Captain Becerra fired that Sabo round at 3.2 kilometers at that T-72, and I watched the turret be blown off of it. Unbelievable. We had devastating equipment. The Iraqis were greatly outmatched, and despite some heroic bravery on the part of many Iraqis who tried to fight, many just gave up, many tried to fight, they didn't stand a chance. And so you don't need the standard 3-to-1 ratio to have that advantage. So, wow, we just blew right through them. So here are some of the battlefield challenges, folks. Some of the things we faced out there as we fought in this combat. Let me just explain some of this to you guys so it makes a bit of sense. All right. How did you all wash? Well, baby wipes, a little water poured into your hands from a canteen or from a water tank, and then you just scrub. You can get a proper shower, folks. So here's some of the battlefield challenges. First off, chemical gear, POWs, fuel, rate of march, and IFF, identification of friend or foe. Now, when you think of IFF and you think of military terms, people normally, they think about aircraft. First off, the chemical gear. Bear in mind that even though it was cold and it was rainy and it was wintertime, it was still warm once you put on your tanker's Nomax and you put on all your kit, your body armor. You're wearing body armor. And then you've got your Kevlar. But underneath that, you've got, on top of all of that, your protective suit, your mop gear, your chemical suits, which are full of charcoal and weigh a ton and are very unpleasant, and you overheat instantaneously no matter what the temperature's like. So Nomax, on top of that, chemical suit, then your equipment on top of that, your body armor is underneath the chemical suit, or is it on top? I think we left it on top of the chemical suit. Can't remember. And then you wear a mask. Now imagine trying to communicate on the radio while you're calling for fire and being shot at and things are exploding around you wearing this. We wore that mop gear the first 2 days of the conflict. The whole time. When we were moving, we wore mop gear. That mop gear is the chemical gear. It was hideous. It was horrible. I lost so much sweat and perspiration through those suits. It was a terrible experience. Fortunately, the Iraqis never used the chemical weapons, so it didn't pan out. But for the first 2 days, we wore that stuff. Now, that photograph on the bottom side there that you can see, the larger photograph, is a collection of prisoners of war. As we went through the Iraqi divisions, the first ones crossing the berm, they surrendered in mass. These were conscripts, and some of them were American college students who had been drafted when they went home to visit Iraq that summer. They had gone home the previous summer to see family in Baghdad or Mosul, wherever, and Saddam Hussein's government wouldn't let them leave the country to go back to do grad school or undergraduate work back in the States or England or Germany, wherever they were studying. So thousands of college students were drafted into the ground forces, and they didn't want to be there. Not to mention the illiterate farmers and sheep herders that were out there and drafted in, and they weren't well protected, they weren't well equipped, and so many of them just hands up as we came across the border, which was fortunate. But the number of Iraqi prisoners we took was the hundreds of thousands. We took a few 100,000 Iraqi prisoners. That was a major battlefield impediment because you can't, when people surrender, you have to accept the surrender. You have to protect them. You have to safeguard them. You have to disarm them, protect them, safeguard them, and then get them to the rear. That's what the Geneva Convention says. And we treat our prisoners in that fashion. Our prisoners weren't treated in the same fashion. They were tortured and abused. Our pilots were by the scumbag Iraqis, but we treated the Iraqi soldiers with compassion, and many of them remember to this day, those who survived who weren't executed when they returned home. Many were executed, but we treated them well. But they were a major obstacle on the battlefield. I mean, look at this. I mean, you've got all of these prisoners. That's just a small number. I mean, my unit alone, we captured. By the way, my battalion, courtesy of my efforts, my battalion, 3rd Battalion, 8th Cavalry, turned in more captured enemy documents than the entire 7th Corps. Why? Because I, as an intelligence officer, a young lieutenant, realized that the documents captured would be important. So rather than ignore them or destroy them, every document we get our hands on, we took, we packaged up, and we sent back for exploitation. And as a consequence, the U.S. government learned an awful lot about Iraqi forces, about what had been happening, about their capabilities, because my unit turned in more documentation, captured enemy documentation for exploitation than the entire 7th Corps. Now, I forgot about that till just now. I mean, it's not like I got a cup of coffee or something like that, but that was a true story. So, POWs, large numbers of chemical gear, which is very burdensome and uncomfortable, and fuel. We had very long supply lines. Our fuel was coming from Dhahran, folks. Long, long way. So, yeah. Yep. Long way. So, we had to rely on an ever-increasing lengthy fuel source as stuff kept coming from further and further away. Every kilometer we progressed into Iraq and then Kuwait was another kilometer further away from our petrol station. There were no petrol stations up in the neutral zone, none in Iraq in the Western Desert for us. All our fuel was coming from Dhahran. And it was coming up one road where people were prone to have accidents because they drove like morons, third country nationals, or as we call them, TCNs. So it was crazy stuff, folks. There was one point in the battle when we had to stop. Our unit was halted, our entire brigade, while we were engaged with the Talwakanas, and we were told to stop, not because we couldn't advance against the Talwakanas, but because we had no fuel. And the irony is that the M1 Abrams burns more fuel stationary than it does actually moving, because I don't know how it does it, but the turbine engine burns more fuel. So if you're sitting still running the engine, you burn more fuel than moving. But we were told to stop. We had some tanks that were down to 10 to 15 minutes of fuel left before they went dry when the Pennsylvania National Guard showed up with their 5,000-gallon tankers, and they just drove up each tank. The tanks stayed in battle formation, and the tankers drove up, did a hot refuel, drove up, hit the next one, and there were multiple of them, and then we got on the move again. It was crazy. It was unbelievable. You'll never have this sort of situation happen again. This was like being in the Atlantic convoys of World War II with hundreds of ships out there with the wolf packs trying to hunt them and sink them, except we didn't have wolf packs hunting us under the ground. We were just moving forward. It was like being at sea. It was unbelievable, folks. This is an experience that will never be replicated. Thank goodness. And then the rate of march. Someone was asking earlier, how is it that there's a fuel tanker right there, you can see, and a hot refuel. So you can see that someone's asking a question earlier about, well, how in the world did you guys, not get mixed up? Well, we moved at 10 miles per hour, 16 kilometers. We couldn't exceed that rate. Now, when we got in combat and we engaged, we moved much faster than that, to maneuver, not to be shot, not to be hit by artillery, small arms, or rockets, or tank rounds. We would move around. But when we're moving forward, rate of march, when we weren't engaged, 10 miles per hour the whole way. It seems slow, but when you have hundreds of thousands of vehicles, wheeled, tracked vehicles, combat going on simultaneously over a front that's like 600 kilometers wide, it makes sense that you only move at 10 miles per hour so you don't get gaps. Otherwise, you get gaps between units, and then they can be exploited by the enemy. Very dangerous situation. So it was pretty incredible experience from that side. And then finally here, the last thing I want to talk about on this slide when it comes to challenges is fratricide. Fratricide was very real. That's why the V chevron was painted on every vehicle. That's a very important consideration. But we did have fratricide, and a number of Americans died at the hands of Americans in this conflict, which is unfortunate, but it is the fog of war. But the V devices were meant. And now you got to remember that you're probably saying, well, wait a second, Chris, what's the big deal? You had M1s and you had Bradleys. Yeah, we did. But the Brits had Challengers, and they had weird looking armored personnel carriers. And the Syrians were there with us. And the Qataris were there with us, and the Saudis were there with us. And they all had different tanks and different armored vehicles. They had French vehicles. They had Soviet vehicles. I mean, you're going to see a photograph here of the Syrian T-72s. These were our allies. They fought. The Syrians deployed to the Gulf War and attacked Saddam Hussein with us. Yeah. Hafez Assad sent his T-72s to attack Iraq. This was an unbelievable coalition, folks. You'll never see it repeat again. So chemical suits were such a disaster. It's such an uncomfortable burden, but we had them. Prisoners of war, there were so many of them that required our attention. And frankly, the U.S. military wasn't prepared for 200,000 Iraqis surrendering. They really weren't. The military police, normally what you do is you capture them, you disarm them, you safeguard them, and you secure them and send them to the rear. And you take documents for exploitation, that sort of thing. And then the rear is where the military police take over. But the military police brigade was overwhelmed. It was unbelievable. We were slowed down many times because we had prisoners of war that were in the way. So the next thing to talk about here is where are we at now? Well, this is where the 7th Corps found itself the day before the ground conflict ended on the evening of the 27th of February, 1991. And you can see right there, 2nd Brigade, 3rd Armored Divisions, right in the mix of it, just short of Objective Minden, which was our objective. We hit Objective Dorset. We've captured that. We've already fought, and we're going to be facing the Talwakana. So that's what's coming next. Just around the corner, the Talwakana Division, folks. That's our next target here. So, destroying the Talwakana, this is one of the Republican Guard divisions, along with the Hammurabi and others. This is one of the fiercest reputations. It was arguably, supposedly, the best, bar none, mechanized Republican Guard division that the Iraqis had. Experienced, talented, had the best equipment, latest T-72s and such, and we destroyed them, utterly destroyed them. Yep. So you can see here, that's an MTLB, an engineering vehicle, armored personnel carrier on the right, which was undamaged in a revetment, which we captured. And then below that is a T-72 that was destroyed in combat as we faced them. It's difficult for you all to see this map, but what you can see looking at this map, if you look up and down, you can see that U.S. forces are online, in depth, attacking. We came from the west. Let me switch to this map. We came from the west in a Hail Mary end run around, and we turned east. We wheeled east, and when we wheeled east, we came back online. We were online the whole way going forward, And as we swung the door shut, it came like this, and then we moved forward to push them out of Kuwait. And that's what's happening here. So this is the destruction of the mechanized division of the Talakana from the 26th to 27th. And we just thoroughly obliterated them. That was the tank I talked about, that at 3.2 kilometers, Captain Becerra's tank just blew the turret off of it. It was, wow, something else. Unbelievable. So now, this is the disposition of the Corps on the morning of the 27th at 3 o'clock in the morning. That's how closely people are tracking our movements. It's 3 o'clock in the morning, and they know exactly where we're at. This is pretty wild, huh? Pretty wild. While moving for what happens with prisoners, do they move with? No, the prisoners are moved to the rear, Hank. You must move prisoners to the rear. It's an obligation under the Geneva Convention. You are supposed to treat prisoners. Once you've captured them, they're your responsibility. They can't die on your watch. You got to tell that to the Nazis, to the Soviets, but that's how it works. So this was the 3 o'clock in the morning on the 27th, and there's objective. I think I had this map on here earlier. No, this isn't. So here you can see at the top in the center, we passed objective Collins, and we moved forward to attack the Talwakana division, and we went through them. And you see at the top, I didn't mark 2nd Brigade on here, but 2nd Brigade is in the next to last row, that arch that goes across the top there. Below that circle where it says AA Horse, just east of objective Collins. So that was, so I must have messed up on this. I didn't quite put it together right. Sorry about that. I should have put a bubble on that one. So this is the final assault on the morning of the 28th. This is after the cowards in the Bush administration saw the highway of death and called off the war because they're afraid of bad press. Everything was about bad press in this damn war. That was really bad. And it's unfortunate that they were such cowards, because the Iraqis fought another day and impressed and harmed their own people for years after this, because we didn't finish this job here. We let them escape because of the highway of death. But here's, as we closed in, we swing the door shut and we move forward. The center there is the objective Minden. We've moved through it. That's 2nd Brigade, 3rd Armored Division, and that's where I'm at right there. Yep. And that's a logistics truck that we captured from the Iraqis. One of the ones they abandoned. So this is a month later, after the war. This is the 7th Corps, where it was at on the 24th of March, 1991. We're occupying space in Iraq. You can see that dotted line is the demarcation line in which the Iraqi forces had to retreat behind. And we allowed them to stay in Basra, which was a huge mistake, and Al-Zubair, which is another big mistake. But you can see on the right-hand side of that map, you will see that, make sure I got the right thing up here. Oops, you don't see it. The right-hand side of that map, you can see the Rumalia oil field and the 3rd Armored Division. That's where we were. We were located right in that oil field, and that was a pretty sucky place. Pretty sucky. But that's where we were for some time after the war, and then I would make trips back and forth from there down to Riyadh, on several occasions, and back to King Khalid Military City for resources on multiple occasions. But that's after the war. The dotted line is where they were forced to withdraw behind. 11th Aviation Brigade screened up there on the top left-hand side. Then the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment screened in the north. A lot of their soldiers were getting malaria because it was malaria zone. And then we're over there. Some of our soldiers actually got malaria because they didn't follow the instructions they were given to take their malaria. By the way, with this terrible pills we used to take back then, like quinine, it was hard. It's disgusting. You could wrap it in bread and try to eat the bread, and you could still taste it. But those soldiers, we had, I think, a half a dozen soldiers who came down with malaria after we got back to Germany. They got malaria in Germany because they already had it in their system. They just didn't take the pills, and the little buggers came out and got them because they didn't follow instructions. Well, let me show you my luxury location. This was in the Wadi al-Batin. This is the night before the end of the war. On the 27th, I believe this was. I dug this hole by hand for just a few hours of sleep, and you can see all the dirt that I piled up outside, and you see the shovel. My cot is located, actually my cot is in the hole. You can see it had a white canvas cot rather than one of those green nylon ones. So here you go. This is my luxury accommodation in combat the last night of the war. You can see all the armored vehicles up there. This is the command center, the TAC, the Tactical Action Center. Tactical Operations Center. See somebody's cot off to the side there. And off to the side, just by that cot, by that shovel, is where my armored vehicle is located at. But you can see I dug space in there for myself for my cot, and then space to put all my kit on the left-hand side, and then a way to climb up out of the hole forward. So, yep, every night, every single night. Wasn't that special? Yeah, but hey, I'm alive, so what can I say about that? It must have worked. It must have worked. Anyway, so, all right, let's continue on now with the rest of the story, as Lowell Thomas used to say. And now for the rest of the story. So the highway of death is something that was asked about earlier. Well, there you go. There's the highway of death. All right. So the photograph at the top is one that was taken from the book on the history, but the other photographs are mine. So for instance, you can see on the left-hand side is an image of 3 Syrian T-72 tanks located along the highway of death in a patrolling operation after the war ended. You can see some hills in the distance there. This is in Kuwait, and I took that photograph of the T-72s. For me, it was really weird. We were trained to deal with the Soviet equipment as enemies, and here are the Syrians fighting side by side, not on our flank, but over by the Marines further east. They're fighting side by side. After the war, here is Syrian T-72s, and they're not our enemy. We'd always been taught that they were. And then in addition to that, you can also see here that the photograph I took, that T-72s, and then the one, the color photograph in the center there, that is what the carnage looked like. These are mostly civilian vehicles. There's one BTR in the background there, or BTR in the background. But most of those are civilian vehicles stolen from Kuwaitis. Personally owned cars, buses, trucks, stolen by these reprobates. But that's the so-called highway of death. Now, what I should say about the highway of death is that when Colin Powell and George Bush, both of whom have passed away now, were greeted with this information, their reaction was, oh, we've got to stop the war. It looks like we're just being mean. And after 4 days of ground war, when in just another 24 hours, we would have completely cut off the entire Iraqi army and not made them vulnerable to attack by Syria or Iran, but kept them from being meddlesome and troublesome, we could have ended this conflict, and Saddam Hussein likely would have fallen from power in 1991 had we been allowed to do that. So when people talk about the job being unfinished, in that respect, I suppose you could say that. But the mission wasn't to remove the Iraqi government. It was to eject them from Kuwait, which we succeeded in doing. But we lost a golden opportunity because of the cowardice from public affairs and the optics from politicians who didn't let us finish it. And by the way, very few people would have died because by this stage, most Iraqis were simply surrendering and giving up their military hardware, which could have been destroyed. There you go. So the highway of death, I think Courtney was asking about that earlier, and that's what it looks like. Well, while we were out there, I went on patrol with the scouts. And you see a BTR right there. That's a Iraqi scout vehicle that was torched, and they didn't make it any further than that. This is out in the middle of the desert. They got hit up. I'm not sure who attacked them, but we came across them. This is after the ground combat ended, and we were patrolling. You can see the 2 Scout Bradleys there, big vehicles for scouts. And then I'm on a third one here as we did patrolling. This was pretty cool. As an intel officer, I went out with the scouts because what they do is collect intelligence. And you can see on the left-hand side there, even though we're in a desert, it was all sand, because of the rain, look what happened. What you see on the right there became what you see on the left. Grass popping up everywhere because of all the rain. Pretty wild stuff there, folks. This was an interesting experience, to say the very least. Yeah, it's a desert, but hey, there's other stuff going on. So anyway, yeah, that's actually one of my favorite photographs. One of the scouts is he went out to take a look around, make sure nothing was there and nobody was left, and I took that photograph. Pretty cool. You can see one of the scouts in his Nomax in the top. Nomax is the flame retardant tanker suits on the top of his vehicle there on the right-hand side. I really like that one. Now, the Iraqis committed crimes against humanity as part of their conflict in Kuwait. They decided to torch all of the oil wells in a bout of spite that was an ecological crime of epic proportions, which the world has never brought Iraq to bear for. They never paid a price for the crimes against humanity. And I'm talking about the country of Iraq and the people who set these fires. But the next thing I'm going to show you is the burning oil wells. This was absolutely horrific. Now, I slept less than 1 kilometer away from these burning oil wells each and every night. It was a horrible, horrible experience, folks. It was unbelievable. As a consequence, I later developed adult onset asthma as a consequence of my exposure to these chemicals that were burned from these oil wells that floated down in the soot and landed on us every day, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for several weeks in a row, about 6 weeks. And this is what I dealt with. It was unbelievable. So the photographs here are taken from me driving along in a vehicle. Someone else was driving at the time. And those are just a few hundred meters away. This was all of northern Kuwait. Unbelievable. Unbelievable garbage. Horrible stuff. There's a super chat from Courtney McBride. Says he'll post pics of his time in Kuwait in WhatsApp. Okay, Courtney, thank you for sharing that. Thank you for the $1.99 super chat. So this was a crime against humanity that the Iraqis got away with, and the world has never brought them to book for this. This is unbelievable, the amount of carnage. All the oil was wasted. All the energy was destroyed. The billions of dollars of damage, the ecological carnage that was wreaked in the Persian Gulf, all because of this nonsense. Of course, they sent wildcatters from Texas to put these fires out. This was horrific, absolutely horrific. And the Iraqis were never really brought to book for this, and they should have been. So this whole thing was a pretty massive undertaking, folks. It was massive undertaking. It seriously was. To just give you an idea of the scope of this. So this is just 7th Corps, okay? I'm not talking about the entire force, which was over 600,000 supposedly. I know it was 450,000, but the 600,000 troops were there from all nations. But on the left-hand side, you can see the organization there. 3rd Armored Division, Major General Funk listed at the top. And then 2nd Brigade. You can see 2nd Brigade is Colonel Robert Higgins, Diggin Higgins. And then the 3 battalions that are part of the brigade, the combat battalions. They're called cavalry, but they're organized as armors. So 4th Battalion, 8th Cavalry is Lieutenant Colonel Beaufort Hallman, Colonel Hallman. And then 3rd Battalion, 8th Cavalry, Lieutenant Colonel Tim Lupfer, former speechwriter for the commander, Supreme Commander of Allied Powers Europe, and a noted author on tactics about Rommel when he taught at West Point. And 4th Battalion, 18th Infantry, which is Lieutenant Colonel Fulcher. Yep, that was pretty cool. Hallman, Lupfer, white guys, Fulcher's a black guy, and Higgins was a white guy. Not that it matters. Personnel strength, and you look over here, the 3rd Armored Division had, this is at the 1st of March after we were in combat, so it's about 2,000 less. We had 148,000 before, so we had some casualties. But we didn't have 2,000 casualties. Some people were taken back for other reasons. 3rd Armored Division, 17,658 people, and I am one of those 17,658. Out of 146,321 on the 1st of March, 1991, after the conflict. Yeah, 146. Can you imagine moving 146,000 people around, folks? That's just crazy stuff. Crazy stuff. So here you go. This is going home. So that is the night before we departed, and there you can see me with my boonie cap on. Yep, that's what we call those boonie caps. Yep. So, yep, it's my boonie cap. I have only worn that one time, and that was then. And then Scott Lakauskas is there. Kevin McCall, who later worked for another organization. He's on the right wearing the eyeglasses. On the left is Steve North. And I don't know who the other folks there. We turned and someone took a photograph of us just before we left on that final night. And there is the boonie cap. Still fits, folks. Look at that, all these years. And that's the one where I had that little side kicked up there and bent up like that. But this thing's been stored in a box for so long. Yeah, so the boonie cap. Never wore this until that night. And then wore it the next day. That was it. Pretty crazy stuff. Yeah, and then in the background, which you can't see very clearly because of the way the photographs came out here, that's actually at King Khalid Military City, because initially we were told we were going back to King Khalid Military City in May to leave the country, or in April. But what happened was we went to King Khalid Military City. We wasted time and energy. We set this thing up, and I was on the advance party again. I went there, and we set up a tent, and we had all the base set up, the medical facilities, everything, and everyone was supposed to come back there. And then in the end, nobody came there. We built this entire tent city in King Khalid Military City, just east of the city, further west than where our assembly area was earlier, for no reason. It was a complete waste of time and energy. Every day, a fuel truck full of diesel would drive up and down the dirt and just pour the dirt out from behind so that dust wouldn't blow everywhere. It was one incredible waste of resources. So much oil in Saudi Arabia, they just poured millions of gallons of diesel out on the ground just so the dirt wouldn't kick up. It was unbelievably insane. But that's what that photograph there is, folks, on the left-hand side. You can see the tent's blown down and everything just lying around. It was pretty sucky, pretty sucky. So I finally got to go home, and my homecoming was kind of screwed up too. So I got to be on the advance party, and I got to be the last people back. Our brigade came back on the 19th of May, 1991, which is 6 months after I arrived, but only about 4 or 5 months for a lot of people. What's that? Theodorus says, how did the war serve U.S. national interests? I'll come back to that. Let me finish my story, please, Theodorus. So I was supposed to be home on the 19th of May during the daytime, and what happened was that the flights were screwed up for some reason. I'm not sure what happened, but we were kept there all darn day. And actually, I said that was the night before that photograph. That was the night we departed, because we actually left in the evening, and then we got back to Germany. Anyway, I can't remember when we left. Maybe we left in the day we got there in the evening. But I got to Germany, landed at Rhein-Main, and then was bused to Gelnhausen, which had a parade for our brigade. So the support battalion, 45th Support Battalion, the 418 Infantry, the 48 Cav, and the brigade headquarters all arrived on the 19th, which I don't remember. I think it might have been a Friday. They arrived during the day. The Germans had a huge parade for them. They welcomed them back with open arms. They were so grateful for them to come back. My battalion was the last one that got to come back, and I didn't get back to Gelnhausen until 2 o'clock in the morning. There were no Germans, no umpas, no bands, no parade. Nobody gave a flying flip that we were back. There were no New York City ticker tape parades. There were no free rides to Disney World, no free entry here, none of this SeaWorld stuff, none of these gifts, none of this money handed to anybody. We went back from the war, and on Monday we went back to work. Yep, went right back to work. Yep. So anyway, this was my Freedom Bird right here. I'm going to show you this. The last time I ever flew TWA, Trans World Airlines. TWA, Trans World Airlines, my last flight. And, oops, something's messed up there. Sorry, I had that happen. Give me a second here. I got to adjust that. That's not supposed to be there. Okay, where's this at? Whoops. I screwed it all up. That got messed up. Well, that was a picture of me. The picture of me... I don't know how that happened. That was a picture of me that was shaving. That's a nice photo. Somehow I got a picture of the port there. It should have been removed. Sorry about that. I can't remove it now because I'm in display mode. But then that's there. So there you go. And I just realized that now. But I was shaving that morning before we flew, and that's me in front of the plane. And then this picture here, which of course is me at 2 o'clock in the morning when I got back to Germany there, wearing this top and the cap that you just saw. And that was on May 20th, 1991, if I remember my dates correctly. So, wow, such a long time ago, folks. 32 years ago. It's just shocker there. Yep. The nose isn't any bigger. The ears aren't any bigger. The hair is still there, just as thick. It's just not blonde and brown anymore, or strawberry blonde. Yikes. So, yeah, there you go. Second Lieutenant, Butter Bar. It wasn't too long after this I made first lieutenant, a few months down the road, because at that time you had to be a lieutenant for 2 years to get promoted. So, yep, let me just escape that. Okay, now I can get back and I can change that. That was a mistake there. I'll show you that picture again, what it's supposed to look like without that in there. So there you go. Okay, let me show you that again. All right, so display. There we go. All right. All right, now I can get this correct, I think. All right, where are we at here? Something's not right. Okay. There we go. Now you can see that photograph. There you go. So that's me shaving that morning. Wearing my Casio G-Shock watch. That used to be my old standby Casio G-Shock all the time. So those are the... what's going on here? Sorry. Give me a second here. All right. So save that. So that's the presentation, folks. Let me see what people have got to say. What have I missed here? Anything? Highway death similar to Tank Alley. Theodorus had a question, which I'm going to get to in a second. Lived and worked in the Middle East for years on and off. Nothing there makes sense at all. Just carry on working. Yep. Really cool camo color in the pics and what you're wearing now. Yeah, it's the same shirt. This is the shirt that I had all that time back then, folks. All that time back then. Yep. Yep. But I only wore it shortly. We wore the green ones the whole time. How did the Gulf War feature against the Iraq War in terms of size? We were much larger. We had 600,000 troops. They had about 193,000 troops in the Second War. They learned a lot, plus our lethality became much stronger and our capability. We needed far fewer forces to accomplish the same thing. And actually, they went a lot further. Remember, serves me, there was black snow in Europe because of the fires. That may be true, Maryland. I don't know. I was breathing it in each and every day. Highway death, Iraqi army retreated from Kuwait. Cars and trucks burned. Yeah, there were almost no tactical vehicles. Almost everything was stolen. And Courtney, thank you for the $2. What else? What do you call a Marine that can't follow orders? A dead Marine. That's funny. Okay. Still a kid when this war happened. I remember there were being very little to no opposition from hippies and peace activists. Correct? Yeah. That's because the Bush administration, who was hypersensitive about appearances, were very focused on making sure that people supported the war. They put a lot of effort into it to sell people that it was necessary. Yep. Dylan says that was awesome. Chris, you are tall. Yes, Eric, I am kind of tall. And Theodorus says, awesome picks, Colonel. Okay, well, let me answer Theodorus' question there. Theodorus, Okay, how did the war serve U.S. national interests? Okay, so now I'm going to just philosophize a little bit here and just tell you something. So when I went to the war, I was in Germany. First off, I watched events unfold when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. Let me go ahead and I'm going to stop this and switch over to the other camera. Give me a second here, okay, folks, because this one's a little slower processing. Give me a second here. I'm going to stop this. Give me a second. Okay, so I'm off camera now. Just give me a second, and I'll take care of that. And now I'm back on camera. That's a little bit better. That was the software that runs the camera, so and I can bring other stuff in. So I'm not using the more presentation now. So let me just explain. So when I was watching Saddam Hussein invade Kuwait, I was like, wow, well, that's a bit of a shocker. And then I watched as the 82nd Airborne sent troops there. Then the 24th Infantry Division was deployed there. All these units from the States. And I'm like, oh, I'm in Germany. I won't be going to this. And then in November, the president announced that they would be sending additional forces to give an offensive capability, not just defensive capability, to evict Saddam Hussein and the Iraqis from Kuwait if they didn't withdraw. So in order to do that, they need hundreds of thousands more troops. And I'm like, okay, well, they announced the 7th. And I was listening to that. It was on, was it Columbus Day? Not Columbus Day, but Veterans Day weekend, I think it was. He announced, and we had a long weekend. We had an extra day off, so I was going to Austria. And Bush announced that we would deploy the 7th Corps. And I'm like, yeah, 7th Corps, cool. I'm in 5th Corps, not to worry about that. And he announced the 1st Armored Division, the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, the 11th Aviation Brigade, all of which belong to the 7th Corps. And I'm like, okay, cool. And I'm about to go on my 4-day weekend to Austria and enjoy myself in my little Honda CRX. And he says, and the 3rd Armored Division, I'm like, what? 3rd Armored Division? We're in the 5th Corps. We're not part of the 7th Corps. And it was at that time, as a young lieutenant, I realized, I learned that corps are not fixed structures. They are adaptable. You can add and subtract units at will to accomplish the mission. So suddenly we're going. Then I found out, and I went, no one called and said we were alerted. We didn't have to go to work. I left. I left Thursday night or Friday morning. I left on on the weekend, and Friday, Saturday, Sunday. I came back. My neighbor, Bob, I ran into him. He goes, where have you been? I said, Austria, man. Why'd you go to Austria? Because it's a long weekend. Yeah, but we had to work. I said, what do you mean you had to work? Nobody called me. And we didn't have cell phones back then, right? By the way, I lived in the apartment buildings 100 meters from the barracks where I worked at. So you went out the back gate, walked 50 meters, turned left, walked up steps, and that's where our apartments were. And he said, well, they came looking for us because we were here this weekend and we went to work. I said, well, good for you. My argument was, if I'm going to go and die in combat against the Iraqis, I want to enjoy my life right now. So I had a great weekend, and then he didn't. And then we prepped and we worked every day. And then I deployed in the advance guard, and I went down there. But how did it serve U.S. interests? That was the question. That's what I'm getting to. At the time, I'm listening to all these lefties, and there were, Courtney doesn't remember because he's a little kid, but there was plenty of opposition to the Gulf War when this thing first started. But by the time the coalition was put together, it was pretty obvious that his behavior was terrible, particularly when he used Americans as hostages. That pissed off a lot of even the Greenies. And so, but a lot of people are like, well, this is a war for oil, war for oil, war for oil. And I listened to that, and I'm like, okay, well, here I am, a soldier being deployed for this war for oil. Is it about oil? Sitting in the desert after we had defeated the Iraqis, and I was in Kuwait sleeping in a hole that collapsed on me that night because of the rain. All the sand collapsed on me. I woke up. I was almost a mummy. I had to dig myself out from my sleeping bag. I had an epiphany, and it seemed to me, I realized that let's pretend that the war was about oil, okay? Let's pretend that this was all about oil. So it's all about oil, okay? Great. What does that mean? Well, the oil coming from Iran, the oil coming from Iraq, the oil coming from Kuwait and Saudi Arabia was by and large going to 2 locations, Europe and Japan. Not China. They were a non-factor in 1990. Their economy was a joke. Not the United States. We did get about 8% of our oil from the Middle East, but not much. Europe got almost all its oil from the Middle East, almost all of it, or from North Africa. And so if Saddam Hussein had been able to capture 1/4 or 40% of the world's oil reserves by having Iraq, capturing Kuwait, and then capturing Saudi Arabia, which is what the threat was, well, folks, then he could have dictated oil prices around the world and caused global recession, costing millions of jobs, misery, a global depression perhaps. And so if the war was about oil, then it was about oil in this standpoint. The United States' national goal is the prosperity of the United States and the world in general, so that we have markets to trade with. People can buy our goods and services. The world is not served by the world being pushed into an artificial recession like the one that Biden and Putin have caused now, because this guy controls all the oil and he conquers countries. So if it was for oil, I didn't have a problem with it, because it's not me that's going to suffer if the oil from Iraq is cut off. If the oil from Iraq is cut off, it's going to be the Europeans and the Japanese who suffer directly. And more directly, it's going to be the Ivorians who grow cocoa, and there's nobody to buy it because they can't afford it because the country's in recession. The price of fuel has tripled. It's going to be the people who grow cotton in Mali. No one's going to buy their cotton. It's going to be the rice growers in Vietnam. No one's going to buy their rice because no one has the money. The people downstream, the lowest rung of the economic ladder, are going to be the ones that suffer the most. So my epiphany was that maybe the war is about oil, but that's a geostrategic issue. The bottom line is this: the safe, reliable, efficient, and affordable and availability of energy is critical in the modern world, and everyone needs it. So that was in the U.S. national interest to do that. Absolutely. Absolutely 100% in the U.S. national interest. Besides that, the Saudis have been our close allies, not in a treaty, but allies since the 1930s when the royal family first started working closely with the Americans over the Brits. We've had a long history with the Saudis, good or bad, and they were our allies at the time. They asked for our assistance. So there was no way that the leaders of the world were going to let one tyrant control 40% of the world's oil reserves, or oil production, I should say. So it did serve our U.S. interest, Theodorus. Does that answer your question? I hope that helps. How many men in your brigades? Well, it depends on the type of brigade, Garrett. So those brigades, when you take all the combat arms and combat service support, can be up to 4,000 or 5,000 troops. But our battalions, our armor battalions, were about 650 people. The infantry battalion was about 850. So 13, 8, a little over 2,000 for the 3 combat arms, and then you've got the support battalion, which has another 600 or 800 people in it. Then you've got intelligence guys that come along, you've got signal guys that come along, you've got air defense attachments, slices that come along, all that stuff, and you wind up with 4,000 or 5,000 troops. Yeah. So that's yeah. Pics were just posted. Okay. Thank you for great analysis. I understand the Gulf War much better. Okay, well, I hope you did. Hope you found it interesting. I hope you didn't mind me wearing this top, which I haven't worn since 1991. I could still put it on. I was pretty happy about that. Yeah, it's pretty cool, even though I'm a bigger boy than I was back then. Yeah, so those are my personal recollection experiences. I didn't read from the book. I'm probably going to do some audio and just read these histories of the Gulf War for the podcast so people can listen to them. But that was just my recollection. I didn't talk about everything. I mean, look, some of the stuff was pretty interesting. I remember one of the experiences I learned about the Gulf War, which is a good lesson for me as a young man, was that it doesn't matter what the human condition is. People are naturally inclined to bitch and moan and piss and whine and cry. Let me give you an example. So I had just fought in combat. Artillery rounds exploding around me, literally shrapnel whizzing by my ear, literally, bullets whipping by me, dodging bullets in combat, artillery rounds going off, and then living in holes in the rain, miserable, out in the middle of nowhere. Don't even know there might be bad guys coming to get you because we don't know the situation. Who knows? Are they all gone? Did they all run away? Did they all retreat? Did we capture them all? Who knows? I go from that to driving back down to King Khalid military city after the war is over to get some funds to do local purchase because I was a Class A agent and a field ordering officer, 2 different functions in the Army. Anyway, so the Class A agent is the one who dispenses money, so you deal with the banks and such, and then you have the field ordering officer who buys things. Anyway, so from commercial sources rather than the supply system to get things at short notice. So I went to King Khalid military city where they'd set up a bank. Now, this bank was in an air-conditioned building. Okay, this bank was housed by a Puerto Rican National Guard unit. The Puerto Rican National Guard unit at this bank, which is at King Khalid military city, where each of them had a car. They were given a car, like a little Toyota. They were given their own Toyotas. They stayed in apartments. They had air conditioning. They ate hot meals all day, and they had satellite TV. They worked in an office building from 9 to 5. I was standing in line to get money to do purchases, listening to these whiny National Guardsmen. When do we get to go home? Bosch Zebra just gave an awesome super chat. 762 Rand. Thank you for that, man. Thank you. Was it set for 7.62 for the AK-47? Thank you for your service on the show. You're welcome, Bosch Zebra. Thanks for being here. I appreciate it. So these whiny Puerto Rican National Guardsmen were complaining, when do we get to home? They have been there for 3 weeks. after the war was over. They had been there for 3 weeks after the war was over, and they're whining about going home, living in air conditioning. Now, I'm not attacking the Puerto Rican National Guardsmen. I'm just saying that look how good they had it, and they complain. Meanwhile, out in the bush, when we were out there in the desert, there were people complaining about those conditions too. It didn't matter. When I was at the headquarters, the RSEN headquarters in Riyadh, I went down there for the United States military training missions, USAMITM, and Major General Don Kaufman, the first general ever court-martial in the U.S. Air Force. I knew him. His son was in my unit. Don Kaufman, I went down there and stayed in an apartment building with all these colonels and such. I was a lieutenant. We're doubling up in the rooms. It was during the war, before the war and after the war started, to buy things in Riyadh. And in the breakfast club where people were eating Belgian waffles with strawberries and blueberries in Riyadh, as our planes are blowing up Baghdad, hundreds of people eating in the officers club, listening to people bellyache about being, it's unbelievable. So I discovered the human nature is humans just like to complain regardless of how good they got it. So there you go. Regardless of how good they got it. Yep. Mel says, thank you for a good summary of any war, I think. Yeah, well, thank you so much for that. It's very kind of you. I do appreciate it. All right, so this was, as promised, a members exclusive. Everyone who's here is a member, a paying member. Thank you for being paying members. I'm very grateful. Thank you for Boss Deborah and for Courtney and for the others who gave us Super Chat. Very generous of you during a members exclusive to give Super Chats. I really appreciate it. Gets us off a good start. After yesterday, we had a good day on the channel for Super Chats. So thank you for that. I'll try to do more things like this if they interest people. But I thought this would be a really cool one because people have been asking about it for a long, long time. By the way, this is not some trophy I hang somewhere. This is in a Rubbermaid container in the basement along with the trousers, folded up since 1991. Now these I might not be able to get into, the trousers. But yeah, so it's I don't carry an ego. I don't think I'm bigger than I am for my shorts. And honestly, these things you see, there's not decorations all over the wall. That's just who I am. That's not a good or bad thing. That's just who I am. That's the actual modesty, which a lot of people don't really believe is there, but that's their problem. Anyway, thank you all for tuning in. I appreciate it so much. This will keep for members only. We'll see if anyone else watches. If no one else starts watching as a member the next couple of days, then I'll open it up for everyone to see. So I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much for your support. There is another super chat coming up from David Suber. $20. Oh man, thank you for that. Wow. $20 super chat. Thank you for that, David. Yeah, thank you so much for that. And let me wrap up by saying the following. When I left for the Gulf War, we had been told, now remember, we trained to fight the Soviets and some training for North Koreans in case we went to Korea. So that was the threat we discovered. Now, the good news for us is that the Iraqis used a lot of equipment from the Soviets. T-72s, MTLBs, BTRs, 2S1s, D-30s, all that stuff. And so that was helpful. But the Iraqi tactics were very complicated and confusing. They were a mixture of British and French and Arab and Soviet tactics. And no one taught us that. We had to learn on the fly. My battalion, in no small measure because of our intelligence organization and the leadership of our battalion, brigade, division, and the plan in general, but our intelligence also played a role. Not a single fatality in our battalion. Not one soldier was killed in combat. Not one. Many units can't say the same thing. That's good fortune, that's good luck, but it's also good planning and good execution. And little notch in the feather there with the most documents turned in, that was pretty cool. I'd forgotten about that. But when I left, we were presented with an army with 750,000 soldiers that was one of the best 3 in the world, we were told. That it was that good. It was that amazing. Of course, a lot of people didn't stop and scratch their head and say, wait a second, including me as a second lieutenant. I was too busy focused on where I was going and learning what the Iraqis do in combat. But a lot of people should have pointed out, and I should have been one of them, and said, wait a second, isn't this the same Iraqi army that couldn't defeat the Iranians in a decade-long war, 8 years long, in which the Iranians would take 14-year-old boys and march them across minefields to set off the mines, to clear them, instead of clearing them properly? Yeah, that same Iraqi army. But we were told by the Defense Intelligence Agency, which I later worked for, and by the defense establishment, and by our government, and by the UN, that these were the evil, atrocious, horrible, impressive Iraqis, especially Republican Guards. Well, we went through them like crap through a goose. We went through them like a hot knife through butter. Doesn't mean they weren't brave people. And I felt bad for the Iraqis. They didn't stand a chance. we could destroy their tanks with our tanks at 3 or 4 kilometers, and they couldn't even hit us firing from 2 kilometers away. We sent A-10s and F-16s, interdict them for weeks on end, pummeling them every night. It must have been horrific. It must have been horrible. It must have been unbelievably frightening for them each and every night. Abandoned by the leaders. We came across units where entire officers disappeared. I interviewed a lieutenant who was a transportation officer, interrogated, not really interviewed, not with rubber hoses, just asked questions. I had an Eritrean medic who was in my battalion who spoke Arabic because he was a Muslim. And so I used him to interpret, and we interrogated this lieutenant. And I said to him, I said, "You're the only officer we found here. We found a bunch of soldiers and you." He goes, "Yes, I'm the only officer." I said, "Where are the officers?" "Well, last night, we were told, the commander said that there was a meeting for all officers at the brigade headquarters. So all the officers left, and they never came back. Do you know why? They fled back to Iraq, and they left their men to die at our hands. Now, fortunately, that unit, most of them surrendered as we approached them. It was a transportation unit, so they weren't interested in fighting. Yeah, but wow, that's horrible. War is never the answer. It is a legitimate means of political discourse, but it's never the right answer, folks. And I'm fortunate that, having served in combat multiple times, that I survived with all my fingers and toes and my brain mostly in working order, not to mention my life. So I'm grateful for that, and for all the people who developed the Apache, the A-10, the multiple launch rocket system, NOMAX, the tanker suits, and for the Saudis for their fuel and for their patience. And yeah, so I'm still here. Anyway, thank you all very much. Have a lovely day. Appreciate you tuning in, and we'll make this available at some point to everyone else. Have a good evening. At least they had a foe whom would give them quarter if they surrendered. Yeah, it is. It is true, Wandering Turtle. It is true. And I'll go one more story on that. So when we were taking prisoners from that unit, from the transportation unit, I came across a couple soldiers as I was walking across the battlefield, which was dangerous, by the way, because our DPCIM, our cluster bombs were all over the damn place, unexploded, and people were stepping on them, so I had to be careful because they didn't explode properly. Anyway, I walk across where they're taking these POWs, and they were being they're roughhousing them, pushing them around and stuff, and I grabbed a soldier and said, "What are you doing?" "Well, we're taking these prisoners." I said, "No. You treat them with respect. You disarm them. You take the officers and NCOs, you segregate them, and anyone that might be a potential intelligence value, you send them to me. The rest you send to the rear. We don't behave that way." Which is why it was so difficult for me to grasp that we were responsible as an army for Abu Ghraib and the abuses there. It's just so alien to me. That's not the army that I was in. But it was the army I was in. My army was doing that in Iraq while I was in Africa. It still shocks me to my core this day. But of course, this is the same army where someone dresses up as a major, morbidly obese, balding, pretending to be a woman, and we endorse that in uniform. Not only are they endorsing it, they're embracing it. The world has gone crazy. Anyway, we'll never repeat what we had in the Gulf War. It was an unbelievable experience. And it was born out of the futility of Vietnam by a coterie of officers who refused to let our army be destroyed by politicians and rebuilt it. And a country that allowed us to do it. All right, folks, thank you very much. Have a lovely, lovely day. Yep. And I'll see you guys later on. Thanks for your support. Tomorrow's the 4th of July, Independence Day for America, and happy birthday to America. We'll see you guys later. Cheers.